She was left for dead on an alien world, until a human walked into the smoke. The battlefield moon of Vespera stank of ozone and decay. Captain Julian Reeves adjusted his respirator and squinted through the haze that clung to the broken landscape. What was once a Virelian research outpost now resembled a jagged wound, all twisted metal and crumbling concrete. Smoke billowed from a dozen impact sites where Alliance missiles had found their marks. "Base, this is Recon Team Alpha," Julian whispered into his comm. "Eastern quadrant appears clear of hostiles. Continuing sweep for survivors." "Copy that, Alpha," came the scratchy reply. "Extraction in 4 hours. Remember your orders." His orders. "Find any surviving Alliance personnel. Assess Virelian casualties. Document evidence of illegal bioweapons. Simple, clean." Julian sighed and gestured to his squad to split up and cover more ground. He'd take the central hub alone. The structure was mostly intact, though its eastern wall had collapsed entirely. Check. "In every 15, he instructed. "And remember, this isn't a combat mission. We're here to gather intel, not engage." As his team disappeared into the smoke, Julian approached the hub's shattered entrance. The door hung askew, its security panel still blinking feebly with residual power. Inside, emergency lights cast everything in a ghostly blue glow. The silence was deafening after 3 days of constant artillery fire. Julian moved cautiously, his boots crunching on broken glass. The control room had been ransacked, data cores removed, screens shattered. Then he heard it, a ragged breath. Julian's rifle came up automatically as he pivoted toward the sound. In Haige, the far corner, partially hidden behind a fallen support beam, lay a figure. A Virelian. Female. Wounded. Julian approached cautiously, rifle still raised. The Virelian didn't move, but her eyes, silver as polished mercury, tracked him with predatory awareness. Her violet skin was streaked with indigo blood and grey ash. The white fabric of her combat vest was torn and charred, revealing old scars that crisscrossed her torso. Long emerald green hair spilled around her shoulders, matted with blood. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, sleek, lethal, and utterly foreign. "If you're going to kill me, human," she rasped in accented standard, "do it properly." Julian lowered his rifle slightly. "I'm not here to kill you." Her lips twitched in what might have been a smile or a grimace. How disappointing. He scanned her body quickly for weapons. There was a blade strapped to her thigh, but it was out of her reach. Her right leg was clearly broken, the violet skin darkened to nearly black around the fracture. A deep gash ran across her left shoulder, still seeping indigo blood. Protocol was clear. Document enemy casualties, collect identification, move on. But something in those silver eyes made Julian hesitate. "What's your name?" he asked, lowering his rifle completely. She laughed, a harsh sound that dissolved into coughing. "You want to know my name before you execute me?" "How courteous," I told. I'm not here to kill you." Julian unclipped his canteen and approached slowly. "I'm Captain Julian Reeves, Alliance Expeditionary Force." The Virelian watched him with narrowed eyes as he knelt beside her. Up close, he could see the fine ridges that lined her temples and jaw, evolutionary adaptations to Virelia's high-pressure atmosphere. "Naira Vesh," she finally said. "Commander, Virelian Defense Corps, and now that we've exchanged pleasantries, human, what do you intend to do with me?" Julian offered the canteen. After a moment's hesitation, Naira reached for it with a trembling hand. Her fingers, longer and more slender than a human's, brushed against his as she took the water. "First," Julian said, "I'm going to stop that bleeding. Then we'll figure out what to do about that leg." Naira's silver eyes widened slightly. "Why would you help me? Our people are at war." Julian removed his medkit from his tactical vest. "Because there's been enough death on this moon, and because my orders were to assess casualties, not create more." "Your superiors won't approve," Naira said, wincing as Julian applied a pressure bandage to her shoulder. "Probably not," he agreed, working quickly. "But they're not here." As he treated her wounds, Julian felt Naira's gaze boring into him. The silence between them was charged with unasked questions. Why this war? Why such hatred between their species? Why this small act of mercy amid so much cruelty? A distant explosion made them both tense. Julian checked his tactical display. "Scavenger drones," he explained. "They'll be here soon. We need to move." Neera gestured to her broken leg. "I cannot walk." Julian made a quick decision. "Then I'll carry you. There's a supply bunker half a kilometer south that should still be intact. We can shelter there until extraction." "And then?" Neera asked, her voice suddenly quiet. Julian didn't answer immediately. Extraction meant returning to his command. It meant handing Neera over as a prisoner of war. It meant the end of whatever this strange moment between enemies was. "Let's survive the next 4 hours first," he finally said, sliding one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. "Ready?" Neera nodded once, her jaw tight with pain. As Julian lifted her, she was lighter than he expected, though the muscle definition in her arms spoke of considerable strength. "Captain," she said as he carried her toward the exit, her voice barely audible against his chest. "Thank you." Outside, the smoke had thickened and the distant whine of drones grew louder. Julian adjusted his grip on Neera and started moving south, away from the ruins and into uncertainty. In the sky above Vespera, the gas giant Nemara loomed purple and vast, casting an ethereal light across the battlefield. And in that strange light, carrying his enemy through the smoke of war, Julian Reeves began to question everything he thought he knew. The abandoned supply bunker loomed like a ghost in the purple twilight. Julian adjusted his grip on Neera, her indigo blood now seeping through his uniform where her wounded shoulder pressed against his chest. The whine of scavenger drones had faded behind them, but Julian knew better than to feel safe. "We're almost there," he said, more to keep himself focused than to reassure her. Neera hadn't spoken since they left the hub. Her silver eyes remained alert, scanning the horizon, but her breathing had grown shallow. The only indication of her pain was the occasional tightening of her jaw when Julian's movements jostled her broken leg. The bunker door was partially buried, under debris. Julian carefully set Neera down against a boulder and worked to clear an entrance, prying away twisted metal with his combat knife. "Your people built sturdy structures," Neera observed, watching him work. Her voice was strained, but steady. Julian glanced back at her. "We learned the hard way after the Kildarian offensive. Lost 3 colonies to architectural failures before someone redesigned our outposts." "I remember that campaign," Neera said, surprising him. "I was a junior officer, my first deployment." Julian paused. "You fought at Kildaria?" "I did." Something, like pride, flickered across her face. 7th Division. We were ordered to take the Northern Hemisphere." Julian returned to his work, muscles tensing. "I lost my brother at Kildaria." A weighted silence fell between them. Julian finally cleared enough debris to force the door open, its hinges protesting with a metallic shriek. "I lost my bond sister," Neera said quietly as Julian returned to lift. Her ship was destroyed during the orbital bombardment. Their eyes met briefly, a fragile understanding passing between them. Julian nodded once and carefully gathered her into his arms again. The bunker interior was dark and musty but intact. Emergency lighting activated automatically as they entered, casting everything in a dim blue glow. Standard Alliance layout, medical station to the left, communications array to the right, living quarters and supplies in the back. Julian carried Neera to the medical station and gently laid her on the examination table. The facility had been abandoned in haste. Supplies were scattered across countertops, and a half-eaten ration bar sat next to an empty coffee mug. "Let me see what we have to work with," Julian said, rummaging through cabinets. He found pain relievers, antiseptics, bandages, and, most promising, an emergency bone setter, standard military issue, designed for field operations. Neera watched him, her silver eyes reflecting the blue emergency lights. "You're quite competent for a reconnaissance officer." "I was a medic before I was a captain," Julian explained, arranging supplies beside her. "Now, this is going to hurt. The bone setter will stabilize the fracture, but I need to align it first." Neera's lips curved in a bitter smile. "Pain and I are old friends, Captain." Julian cut away the fabric around her broken leg. The fracture was clean, a small mercy. "Ready?" Neera nodded once, her hands gripping the edges of the table. Julian took a deep breath and manipulated the bone back into alignment with a single practiced motion. Naira didn't scream. Her entire body went rigid, and a hiss escaped through clenched teeth, but she made no other sound. Julian worked quickly, applying the bone setter, a sophisticated brace that injected local anesthetic and bone-knitting compounds directly into the fracture site. "Done," he said, stepping back. "It'll hold until proper medical treatment." Naira released her death grip on the table. Indigo blood smeared where her nails had cut into her palms. "Your field medicine is impressive." "War drives innovation," Julian replied, turning his attention to her shoulder wound. It was deeper than he'd initially thought, exposing muscle tissue. "This needs sutures." As he cleaned and dressed her wound, Julian was acutely aware of their proximity. Naira's skin was warmer than human temperature, radiating heat like a small furnace. The ridge patterns along her shoulders and collarbone were intricate, almost like deliberately etched designs. "The markings," Julian said, breaking the silence, "are they natural or cultural?" Naira seemed surprised by the question. "Both. We're born with the base patterns, but they develop as we age. Some are enhanced ritually to denote accomplishments or lineage." She gestured to a complex spiral pattern on her right shoulder. "This marks me as a tactical commander, and this," she indicated a series of jagged lines across her collarbone, "is my family lineage. 12 generations of military service." Julian nodded as he finished suturing her wound. "Impressive legacy." "And burdensome," Naira added quietly. "What about you, Captain? What legacy do you carry?" Julian cleaned his hands on a sterile cloth. "Nothing so visible. My father was a diplomat, actually. He worked for peace between our peoples before the war." "Yet here you are," Naira observed. "A soldier." "Here I am," Julian agreed, a familiar bitterness creeping into his voice. "After Keldaria, diplomacy seemed inadequate." The bunker's communication array suddenly crackled to life, startling them both. Julian moved quickly to the console. "Alpha Team, this is base. Status report," came the static-filled transmission. Julian glanced at Naira, who watched him with unreadable silver eyes, then pressed the response button. "Base, this is Captain Reeves. Eastern Quadrant secure. No Alliance survivors located. Weather conditions deteriorating. Taking shelter in Bunker E7 until extraction." A pause, then. "Copy that, Captain. Extraction in 3 hours, 15 minutes. Any hostile contacts?" Julian's gaze met Naira's across the room. "Negative," he replied. "No hostiles. Just casualties." "Understood. Base out." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Julian moved to the supply shelves and found 2 ration packs, offering one to Naira. "You lied to your command," she stated, accepting the food. Julian opened his ration pack. "I reported what was tactically relevant." "I am an enemy combatant," Naira pressed. "By your military regulations, I should be reported as a prisoner." "Perhaps I'm waiting to see if you prove yourself an enemy," Julian replied, meeting her gaze steadily. Naira studied him, her silver eyes thoughtful. "And if I don't?" Before Julian could answer, the bunker trembled as something heavy landed on the roof. Dust sifted down from the ceiling panels. They both froze, listening to the mechanical whirring and clicking above. "Scavenger drone," Julian whispered, reaching for his rifle. "Larger model, they must have tracked us." Naira pushed herself up, wincing. "They're programmed to eliminate all life forms in a contamination zone. Your alliance deployed them after." "Claiming we used bioweapons." "Did you?" Julian asked bluntly. Naira's expression hardened. "No. That was alliance propaganda to justify the orbital strikes." The drone moved across the roof, sensors whirring. Julian calculated their options. The bunker was secure, but these drones were equipped with breaching charges. They needed to either disable it or move to a more defensible position. "There should be an access tunnel," Julian said, scanning the bunker layout. "Standard design includes an emergency exit." Naira nodded toward the back wall. "Behind the supply lockers. I've studied your bunker schematics." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Of course you have." "Know your enemy," Naira said with the ghost of a smile, as a woe. Julian helped her to her feet. Naira's arm slid around his shoulders. The contact sent an unexpected current through him, awareness of her as more than a wounded enemy, more than a military objective. Their faces were inches apart, her silver eyes locked with his. "Captain," she said softly, "if we survive this, we will have to decide what we truly are to each other. Enemies? Allies? Or something neither of us is prepared to name." Above them, the drone began to drill through the ceiling. The drilling sound intensified as Julian half-carried, half-dragged nearer toward the supply lockers. Her arm was tight around his shoulders, her broken leg barely touching the ground despite the bone setter's support. Each step was a careful balance between speed and stability. "It's breaching directly above the medical station," Julian observed. "Smart. If they were wounded, that's where they'd be." "These aren't simple scavengers," Naira said through gritted teeth. "They're hunter-killers. Latest generation." Julian paused. "How would you know that?" Naira's silver eyes flashed. "Because my division was tasked with countering them. Before your alliance unleashed the orbital bombardment that destroyed our defensive positions." Another layer of complexity in a war Julian had once thought straightforward. He filed the information away and focused on their immediate survival. The HFY supply lockers stood against the back wall, heavy metal cabinets bolted to the floor. Julian eased Naira down against the adjacent wall and began searching for the hidden access panel Naira had mentioned. "Third locker from the right," Naira directed. "Lower quadrant has a recessed biometric scanner." Julian found it exactly where she indicated. A small, almost invisible panel that would read Alliance military implants. He pressed his wrist against it, feeling the familiar tingle as it scanned his subcutaneous chip. Nothing happened. "It's not responding," Julian said, trying again. "Power might be—" The ceiling above the medical station erupted in a shower of metal and concrete. Through the dust cloud descended a machine unlike any scavenger drone Julian had encountered. Nearly 2 meters in diameter, its central body was ringed with sensory apparatus and articulated limbs ending in various tools, cutters, drills, and what appeared to be a mounted pulse cannon. "Down!" Julian shouted, diving toward Naira as the drone's targeting systems came online. The pulse cannon discharged, vaporizing the examination table where Naira had lain minutes before. The air filled with the acrid smell of superheated metal. Julian rolled to his knees, rifle raised, and fired a 3-round burst at the drone's sensor array. The bullet sparked off its armored shell ineffectively. "Kinetic weapons won't penetrate," Naira called. "You need to overload its central processor." Julian ducked behind a toppled supply cabinet as another pulse blast struck nearby. "And how exactly do I do that?" Naira was dragging herself toward a fallen toolbox, her movements fluid despite her injuries. "These hunter-killers have an electromagnetic vulnerability. Their sensors can be overwhelmed by a concentrated EMP burst, which we don't have," Julian pointed out, firing another useless round to draw the drone's attention away from Naira. "We can make one," Naira replied, reaching the toolbox and rifling through its contents. "Your communication array. If we modify the transmitter to discharge its entire power supply at once." Julian understood immediately. It could generate a localized EMP. The drone was methodically destroying everything in the room, working its way toward their position. They had minutes, at most. "Cover me," Julian said, preparing to dash toward the communications console. Naira pulled something from the toolbox, a magnetic spanner, and looked at him with fierce determination. "No, you modify the transmitter. I'll distract it." Before Julian could protest, Naira hurled the spanner at the drone with surprising force. It struck one of the sensory appendages, causing the machine to swivel toward her. "Come, you mechanical abomination," she snarled in her native tongue, the melodic Varelian language turning harsh and challenging. The drone advanced on her position, its limbs extending. Julian seized the opportunity, sprinting to the communications array. His fingers flew over the control panel, bypassing safety protocols and rerouting power conduits. Behind him, he heard Naira continuing to taunt and distract the drone, drawing it away from him. A crash, followed by her sharp cry of pain, made him turn. The drone had cornered her against the wall, one of its mechanical arms pinning her injured leg. Its pulse cannon was powering up, the characteristic high-pitched whine building toward discharge. Julian abandoned the half-completed modifications and lunged across the room, diving between Nira and the drone. He fired his rifle directly into the pulse cannon's emission port, not to damage it but to trigger a premature discharge. The gamble worked. The pulse energy backfired into the drone's weapon system, causing a cascade of small explosions across its surface. It released Nira, limbs flailing as its systems attempted to compensate. "The transmitter," Nira gasped, pushing Julian back toward the console. "Finish it!" Julian scrambled back to the communications array, fingers dancing across the controls. Power rerouted. Safety override engaged. Transmission frequency to maximum. The drone was recovering, its damaged systems realigning. It turned toward them, sensory apparatus focusing on the communications console. "Now or never," Julian muttered, making the final connection. The lights in the bunker dimmed as the communications array drew all available power. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then a wave of invisible energy pulsed outward. The drone froze mid-movement, its lights flickering and dying. It crashed to the floor, inert. Julian exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through his system. He turned to find Nira watching him, her silver eyes wide with something like admiration. "That was impressive improvisation, Captain," she said. Julian moved to her side, examining where the drone had pinned her leg. Fresh indigo blood seeped through the bone setter. "You're bleeding again?" "Worth it," Nira replied, wincing as he helped her to a sitting position. "We're still alive." Julian retrieved his medkit and began redressing her wounds. "That was reckless," he said, though there was no real admonishment in his tone. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Nira countered, "placing yourself between me and that pulse cannon." Their eyes met, mutual acknowledgement of a line crossed. No longer were they simply enemy combatants observing a temporary truce. They had risked their lives for each other. "Why did you do it?" Nira asked softly as Julian worked. "Why protect me?" Julian's hands stilled momentarily. "Why did you create a distraction instead of letting the drone target me?" A faint smile touched Nira's lips. "I asked first, Captain." Julian resumed bandaging her leg, considering his answer. "When I found you in that hub, I made a choice to help rather than harm. I'm committed to that choice." "That's not an answer," Nira said. Julian secured the bandage and met her gaze directly. "Perhaps because in the midst of all this destruction, saving one life, even an enemy's, feels like defiance against the senselessness of this war." Nira reached out, her slender fingers touching the Alliance insignia on Julian's uniform. "And perhaps because you're beginning to question whether I am truly your enemy." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Julian was acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth of her skin, the subtle, alien scent that reminded him of thunderstorms and exotic spices. The moment was broken by the crackle of Julian's comm unit. "Alpha Team, this is base, extraction window approaching. Confirm status and position." Julian moved away from Nira to respond. "Base, this is Captain Reeves. Position unchanged. Be advised, we've encountered and neutralized a hunter-killer drone. Recommend extraction team comes equipped for potential additional hostile mechanicals." "Copy that, Captain. Extraction ETA 2 hours. Hold position." 2 hours. The reality of their situation came flooding back. In 2 hours, Julian would need to make a decision about Nira, prisoner or something else. He turned back to find her attempting to stand, using the wall for support. Her face was set in determination, despite the obvious pain. "What are you doing?" he asked, moving to her side. "Testing my limitations," Nira replied. "If more drones come, I refuse to be helpless." Julian slipped his arm around her waist, supporting her weight. "Stubborn, aren't you?" "A trait our species seems to share," she countered, leaning into him slightly. As they stood together in the half-destroyed bunker, surrounded by evidence of their cooperation, Julian realized they had created something unique in the midst of war, a small pocket of trust between supposed enemies. "We should check if the access tunnel is operational," Julian said after a moment. "If more drones come, we may need an escape route." Nira nodded, her arm tightening around his shoulders as they moved toward the supply lockers. "Always have an exit strategy, the first rule of tactical operations." Something else we agree on, Julian observed. Naira glanced at him, silver eyes reflective in the dim emergency lighting. Perhaps we are not so different after all, Captain Julian Reeves. The way she pronounced his full name, with the subtle intonations of her native language influencing the syllables, sent an unexpected shiver down Julian's spine. Her voice made it sound like something precious, something intimate. Perhaps not, Commander Nairavesh, he replied softly. In the distance, barely audible, came the mechanical whirring of more drones approaching. Their respite would be brief. But in that moment, as they worked together to reveal the hidden escape tunnel, Julian realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer merely survivors thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming something else entirely.